Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome along to our second Dean's Lecture for this year. Really pleased to have you all with us. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Jim Waterston and I'm the Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to what is going to be a great occasion, but I'd like to start first by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Indigenous people that might be with us tonight. I also acknowledge the place of Indigenous knowledges in this university and point out that the First Nations people were our first teachers and first educators, and we certainly hold that very close at the MGSC and making sure that we recognise and support those First Nations people. I always get this part wrong in these Dean's Lectures where I invite one of our esteemed academics to give the vote of thanks at the end, but I don't introduce them, and then when they walk up, people wonder who they are. So I would like Professor Therese Hoffenbeck to wave your hand. We're really thrilled to have Therese with us. She's been here for 5 months from the University of Oxford. We've captured her, and she's brought great credit and enhancement of reputation to MGSC, and we welcome you along, and we look forward to your vote of thanks at the end. So thank you, Therese. And I always make a habit of not acknowledging people in the crowd because everyone who comes here is very welcome and famous in their own right, but we do have royalty with us tonight, so I would like to acknowledge Barry Jones and Rachel Faggoter for coming along. We really appreciate it, and thanks for your work in getting Fiona to be here and bringing her to our attention so that we've got this great occasion. So thank you, Barry. It's always brilliant to have you with us. All right, so it's my pleasure now to present an overview of Fiona McLeod's history and work that she does. And normally I like to go through these bios and perhaps shorten them a little bit, but I was so overwhelmed with how much Fiona's done in her career and life and what an impact she's had that I've decided that I'll just take a little bit longer and let you all know, not the full history, but close to it. So I am delighted to welcome Fiona tonight, and thank you very much for agreeing to it. It's fantastic. And I'll take a few minutes just to let you hear about her exceptional career and her many accolades. So Fiona is a senior counsel at the Independent Bar in Australia, practising in the areas of commercial and public law matters. She appears in jury and judge-alone trials and is also briefed in common law and criminal matters. Fiona is recognised for her clear legal advice, advocacy and strategic thinking. She has represented the Commonwealth of Australia in several major cases, including leading the legal team in the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, Queensland Floods Commission, and the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sex Abuse. Fiona has acted in other notable matters, including leading the legal team representing the Torres Strait climate change case, Pabai versus Commonwealth, the successful plaintiffs in the Murrindindi bushfire class action and the Dondale class action. Fiona has also extensive experience leading national and international legal associations and corporations, including the Law Council of Australia, Australian Bar Association, Victorian Bar and Australian Women's Lawyers. Furthermore, she is the co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Council and an officer of the Bar Issues Committee of the International Bar Association and a member of the Council of Commonwealth Lawyers Association. The Age newspaper has described Fiona as one of Melbourne's most influential, inspirational, provocative and creative individuals. In 2017 she devised, and with the support of the steering committee, led the Justice Project, a landmark project undertaken by the Law Council into the impact of access to justice on vulnerable groups in Australia, launched in 2018. Fiona is actively engaging in supporting government and institutional transparency and integrity. She is the chair of the Accountability Roundtable and a former chair of Transparency International Australia and the Open Government Forum. In 2014, Fiona was appointed to the Victorian Honour Roll of Women, and in 2018 was awarded the Australian Women's Lawyers Woman of the Year Award. In the 2019 federal election, Fiona ran as a Labor candidate for Higgins. During this time, Fiona used her political platform to shine a light on the issues close to her heart. She was asked on TV about the one thing she would like to achieve if elected. She responded that she wanted an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Fiona was ultimately invited to assist the design of the voice with Aboriginal leaders, which she describes as an incredible privilege. In In 2020, Fiona was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in the Australia Day Honours for distinguished service to the law and the legal profession at the national and international level and to women lawyers. Fiona graduated with a Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Laws and a Master of Public and International Law from a very distinguished university, the University of Melbourne, of course. It's hard to believe that she was initially a reluctant law student who struggled with purpose and motivation early on in her law degree. In an interview with the Melbourne Law School alumni, Fiona explains that in her third year she studied with Professor Gillian Triggs, who was also given a Dean lecture here at MGSC, an expert in international law and former President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, who gave Fiona her light bulb moment. She was inspired by the power of international legal mechanisms, especially in cases of human rights abuses. From here, Fiona engaged in her studies and clearly found a passion for the law. Shifting from her professional to more personal attributes, Fiona has been described as down-to-earth, compassionate and with vulnerability and warmth qualities that greatly enhance her advocacy skills. She is quoted as saying, "Some of the most satisfying work I have done at the bar is pro bono work that helps people find pathways to justice and holds someone to account for what has been done to them." Fiona notes there is joy in service in knowing that you are contributing your skills in improving the lot of a person, community or country. Making that contribution allows you to feel you've found your place. As a champion for diversity and inclusion, Fiona has received numerous awards, notably for her contribution to the advancement of women and human rights issues, in particular human trafficking. I'm sure you'll agree that we're very fortunate to have her with us tonight. And without any further ado, can I invite Fiona to come forward and present her lecture, Inequity and Justice, Reclaiming the Law as a Vehicle for Public Good. Thank you very much, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Jim. I don't know if you were noticing, but I've got the same jacket on, so just a few more grey hairs from that photo. So, Jim, thank you very much for your very warm welcome. When I reflect on a list of achievements like that, which must sound very daunting to the students who are sitting at the back of the hall, just remember that occasionally you should say no. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Wurundjeri people. I would like to acknowledge their ancestors and their elders. I would like to acknowledge that their sovereignty of these lands has never been ceded. I extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be here today or who may be watching this lecture after it has been recorded. I commit myself today to supporting the request of our First Peoples to support the Voice in the upcoming referendum. I urge you to reflect on this proposal and to do the same. I'd like to acknowledge the company of our esteemed colleagues from the university, and in particular one of my precious elders, Barry Jones, living legend and former deliverer of this lecture, who's seated before me. Barry likes to tell the story that he's known me longer than I have known him. I suspect that's not quite true. I probably knew you from the inside, but it's a delight to me to have you here as I offer this speech, and I hope I do you proud. I'd also like to acknowledge the large and enthusiastic cohort of legal study students from Lauriston sitting up the back, and your devoted teacher, Peter Edwards, who's brought you here tonight. The future is yours. I'm ready to step aside and hand it all to you, so come at me. I'd like to offer a special shout out to two other former Dean's lecture guests. Gillian Triggs has been mentioned and her place in my journey. I'd like to acknowledge Auntie Lois Peeler and Professor Marcia Langton, two women who've made an outstanding contribution to the lives of Aboriginal people in this state and across the nation. It is a great honour to walk amongst these luminaries, to have met them and to know them in their search for justice. So today's topic, a neat little play on words, I think. My kids do tell me not to make jokes about myself and how clever I am, but I fail at that too. So I'd like to begin by asking a question of all of you. What does justice mean to you, and how does it affect your life? Most of us have that sense of justice when we're very little. Our mothers berate us for something that our brothers or sisters did, and we have that burning sense of indignation at the unfairness of it all. For many of us in this room, able to venture out on a cold Melbourne night to this magnificent institution, steeped in its history, and reflecting the creativity and wisdom of those wise elders who've come before. For most of us, our interactions with the justice system are very remote. We have a vague sense of the complex web of rules, the external order that is imposed on us. For the most part, we accept it willingly. Apart from the odd cheeky 5 kilometres over the speed limit or the occasional text we know we shouldn't be sending while we're driving, or other minor act of rebellion, we settle for this sense of order in exchange for a feeling of safety as a shield against the chaos, the random and unpredictable acts of rage and madness of our fellow imperfect human beings, for reassurance that we will be protected from threats small and large, and a sense of certainty in our dealing with strangers and the unknown quantities of the world. Sometimes known as the social contract. What I invite you to consider tonight is that the law and justice absolutely does not deliver these things: safety, reassurance, protection and certainty for a significant proportion of us. For a significant number of human beings in this lucky, lucky country, our lives are marked by inequity and injustice. Now, you might not be surprised. You might say, well, I can live with that, I'm all right, and it hasn't touched me, my family, my community are okay. For now. Those threats are remote, they're ill-defined, it's the job of government to solve them. And you might also say it's inevitable, this is the nature of human beings. And after all, our justice system stands on solid foundations. It's been tried and tested over centuries and offers us greater protection than many other places in the world, which are marked by corruption, the actions of oligarchs, crime, and the impunity of offenders. Or would you ask, does it have to be like this? Is there another way that we can reconceptualise justice and the promise of the social contract? If you had a clean slate, if you were to start from scratch, would you design a system that punishes the most vulnerable of us for actions that inevitably flow from their lives marked by trauma? Does that even make sense? Great inequity and great injustice in this country gnaws at the edge of our consciousness. We know it's there, like a spectre that is just out of reach. The law is a great grand behemoth, right? And this is the way we've always done things. I'm okay for now, so it must be right. And my teachers tell me the law must be respected. In the law, these failures are no more stark than the daily parade of tragedy before our courts and the pipeline of child protection cases leading inevitably to interaction with the criminal justice system. At least 40 to 50%, 80% on some counts, of children coming before the child protection system are born into families marked by trauma and disadvantage. Their neurocognitive functioning and mental health impaired by exposure to trauma, by the constant flight or fight response of living with violence, substance abuse, and the remnants of intergenerational trauma. So what was designed as a systemic response to individual responsibility for antisocial behaviour, our criminal justice system, has been transformed into a conveyor belt of failure, pre-cradle to grave, especially for our First Nations people. A similar percentage, that is 40-50% of the adult prison population, suffers from some form of diagnosed mental health condition. This is base level. Psychiatrists and psychologists, including my late father, suggest that the numbers are much, much higher if undiagnosed conditions, disability and cognitive impairment are factored in. So exposure to both protective systems, child protection and criminal justice, the operative words here being protection and justice, feed each other in this inevitable pipeline of misery and woe. And the systems that were designed to protect people and us from them are failing. Can I step back for a moment and reflect on my practice? I started out in law, as you've heard, not sure why I was there, really, and probably there, if truth be known, because it wasn't medicine. I had something about a genius older sister who was too hard to live up to. But I was, in my early years as a young lawyer, dreaming of the designer suit, running major corporations' cases, with the occasional chance to draft the constitution of the small island state. I guess many of you who are thinking about practice have such an image, the law and order image of the bright, shiny, high-rise tower with fabulous, hard-working colleagues and lots of money. As it turns out in my practice over the decades, I've been drawn to and acted for people caught up in the system from time to time. And it's those cases, those individuals who have etched themselves in my grey matter, my sense of who I am in the world and who we are as complex creatures with, frankly, absolutely no clue of what we're doing on this exquisite planet. I've acted for those, as you've heard, who've been trafficked and exploited. I've acted for men with manageable mental illnesses facing involuntary treatment and detention. I've seen women lined up outside women's legal services looking for a way out of family violence, but with nowhere to go and nowhere to take their kids. Cases where early intervention could have made all the difference. In that time, including a period as President of the Law Council, overseeing the project that Jim mentioned, our landmark justice project, I found myself sitting in the red dirt in Kalgoorlie, holding women's hands as they spoke of their hopes for their children. Pardon me. In the dirt, watching makeshift ropes swinging from trees where their young men had tried to end their lives. I shared high tea in retirement homes in Townsville where people were isolated and alone in their twilight years when they should be celebrated. I saw women in country towns with fear in their eyes, sleeping in cars, afraid of their own children. I spent hours in cramped back offices of church halls, watching clients line up for a rare chance to solve their complex legal issues in family law, migration, bureaucracies of welfare, and I sat in bare concrete cells in prisons across the country, speaking to people in the moments between the sirens that signalled lockdowns, where those visits were cut short at critical moments. When I say these cases have affected me, they really have. And normally I can deal with it. I've just been immersed in it today. So we watch as people navigate the system. We watch as they struggle with homelessness, domestic violence, unpaid fines, child removal, government benefits, abusive or careless corrections officers, police interactions and court appearances. As elders speak in stern words to young people to try and retrieve them from the system, those young people whose lives are in tatters, where young lawyers again and again seek to offer hope. And I can tell you, I've worked in the law for more than 30 years and advocated for the rights of the most disadvantaged Australians. And the courage of those working on the front line is a beacon of optimism and hope. So this is the system we're in. My undergraduate law years did not prepare me for this. They were marked by the teaching of precedent and judicial method. And really, I had no clue of the real world out there. I also learnt nothing about how laws and policies and judgments are actually made, about the human beings behind those things, their occasional brilliance, their occasional courage, and occasionally how things become truth in the law because of the fellowship of one person with another, their fellowship of a tribe, be it the old schoolboys footy club or the exchange of bottles of wine. I learnt since that time about the cases that really count. Not the cases I'd been learning by heart to recite at exam times, but the cases that push at the edges of the understanding of who we really are. I want to mention 3 cases in particular that have profoundly affected me, and many of them unexpectedly, especially for a young lawyer who thought she'd practice commercial law. But transform me they did, and they made me realise I had a role to play in shaping the experience of justice, both for one person at a time and for many. Let me share some of them with you. The first case was a young woman pursuing her former doctor at the medical board over sexual abuse received while in his care, his psychiatric care. So I was counsel assisting the board. And this is a role that means you don't actually represent the victim. You are trying to assist the board to come to the right conclusion. But your case depends upon their complaint. The young woman suffered schizophrenia, psychosis, anorexia, and as she was giving her evidence recounting what had happened to her, she began to dissociate. I mean, she flipped out of her experience of being in the now and the present and went into that experience of trauma. She couldn't bring herself to name the horrors that she'd faced without breaking down. And I was sitting there as a young barrister thinking, I'm damaging this woman. What on earth are we doing here? The case was simply agony. We had lots of breaks where she yelled at me for abandoning her. And I was very concerned about further damage, offered a number of times to call it off. We could call it off if she wanted to, but she wanted to press on. The case against the doctor was won in part. Her evidence was not accepted because of the state of her mental health and what was considered the unreliability of her evidence. And the charges that she pursued were struck out, which I thought was devastating for her. Justice had failed a woman who had a serious mental health condition because her evidence could not be trusted. 6 months later, the doctor appealed the finding that was upheld. I saw her again. She had gained weight. Her skin was clear and her eyes were bright. She told me that the experience had changed her life and she'd thrown off the guilt and shame that she wore being the victim of this crime. She was writing poetry, and the poetry was a gift. They were poignant, sweet poems that spoke of her experience. She had transformed her life by looking in the face of her violator and saying, no more. The second case was another young woman trafficked to Sydney as a 13-year-old and forced to work in a brothel. Her story opened my eyes to the hideous exploitation of children trafficked and exploited around the world. I thought to myself, I've got no idea how I can help, but I have some skills. I know a bit about the law. I've got a mouth. I can speak. I can think. So let's start somewhere. So I suggested we bring a victims of crime compensation claim, which we then won, and many others have followed since. The case has led me to assist the government to draft new legislation and new policies concerning victims of trafficking. It led to a major program of reform and empowerment of NGOs offering services to those who've been exploited. And best of all, this young woman told me before she died that she did not need to feel ashamed anymore. So shame's a big theme here, and it runs through the experience of victims. The third case was acting for the government and hearing stories of victims of sexual abuse in a Royal Commission into institutional child sex abuse. As frail Aboriginal elders recounted lives they were not particularly proud of having lived after being abused as state wards. That Royal Commission changed the way we think about the rights of the abused and the liability of institutions for abuse that occurred to children in their care. And I've since acted in cases for people whose lives have been utterly destroyed by that abuse when they were children, decades on, trying to hold the system to account that allowed them to be abused in that way. And slowly but surely, the law is recognising the responsibility for the failure to protect our children from harm. So in travelling the country for the Law Council Justice Project, I heard these stories and I wanted to act for every single one of them. We couldn't do that, but it told me very clearly that what was needed was systemic reform of the system and a massive injection of funds so that people's legal issues at least could be dealt with, and then they could get on and deal with the other health, housing, social issues that confronted them. It's absolutely clear to me that the lack of access to justice contributes enormously to cycles of intergenerational trauma and disadvantage within communities. These examples that I speak of are not isolated. The Yurok Truth and Justice Commission, nationally our first Truth and Justice Royal Commission, for whom I am counsel assisting, has heard many, many more. So what was designed as a system to protect us has turned into a system that marginalises and punishes people for their trauma. Make no mistake, the law can be a vehicle for doing good, for righting wrongs and giving people a voice, but it can also be a vehicle for oppression. There are cases today of people being abused or discriminated against in our name, in pursuit, it's said, of a higher good. We isolate people in detention centres offshore so that we feel safe. A good that is decided by others, guided by their own judgments about what is necessary and what is acceptable conduct. And these are the cases that give the lie to notions of equity and our concepts of justice. And these are the cases that call us to test our own moral compass, to reflect on what we're prepared to condone through silence, what we're prepared to walk past, and what it is that we've left to others to respond to. We have left, let's face it, learned elders in the front row, a few nasty problems for the next generation. Climate change is the next big injustice. Our willingness to tackle the existential threat of climate change will compound the hardship for our most vulnerable people. Here we are in 2023 on track for more than 3 degrees of global warming by the end of the century. The collective, joint and several, in legal terms, failure of world governments to keep even to their meagre promises means our precious ecosystems will reach and surpass their hard adaptation limits. We here in this country are amongst the most prolific carbon polluters on the planet. Every single tonne of greenhouse gas emissions matters, and every fraction of a degree of warming matters. So we here hold to our precious inadequate targets as a beacon in the darkness, while knowing full well that we're clinging to an illusion, because what happens to our coal and our gas when burnt and used beyond our borders, we think doesn't matter, but of course it does. Potentially in the lifetime of my daughters and in the lifetime of their children, yet unborn, who I hope to hold in my arms, we face mass extinction events. Those daughters with whom I shared the wonder of the world, the smell of the earth after rain, the rising of the sun, the phases of the moon, the smell of the earth and birdsong. They will confront planetary damage beyond our comprehension. And our First Nations people are and will continue to be disproportionately affected by climate change because of their relationship to the environment and to country. Climate impacts are already threatening cultural knowledge, heritage and traditional practices, and will displace our First Nations peoples from their homes. This truth led me to lead a class action on behalf of the brave people of the Torres Strait, our citizens of Zendith Kes. Now this is an area north of Australia, off the top of the Cape, north of Queensland, comprising around 274 islands in an area of shallow seas, between the Cape York Peninsula and Papua New Guinea. The population on these islands is around 4,500 people, but many more live on the mainland, remaining connected to their island homes. The Torres Strait Islanders have a distinct culture, known as island custom, which includes a unique spiritual and physical connection with the islands and surrounding waters. In this case, we allege the Commonwealth Government has failed in its duty of care to protect them from climate change impacts, to set emissions reductions targets in accordance with science, and to assist them to adapt. Now, the power of cases like this is that we seek to hold government account to its failure to protect citizens from an existential threat. Remember that social contract I remembered at the beginning. Surely this is the very purpose of government and the social contract. Another purpose of a case like this is it allows First Nations people to directly shape the development of the law in a very powerful way. I want to share with you, just briefly, some of the evidence that will be tendered in court. Now, bear in mind this evidence hasn't yet been admitted into evidence, but it's been served on the government, so I feel comfortable that it's appropriate to refer to it selectively. This is the evidence of one elder from one of the islands. He says, "I'm a traditional owner from the Badigal Nation in Zendith Kes. My totem is the Papuan black tiger snake. My wind is Nagai, northwesterly. I remember as a child at a certain time of year, you'd suddenly see a big school of birin birin flying, the rainbow bee-eaters, the little birds. They whistle and you could hear them. When the birin birin migrates, it indicates turtle mating season. Another indicator of the turtle mating season would be the woiba fruit, which starts to flower at around the same time, producing a fruit that looks like a turtle embryo or egg, the woibad. The names are familiar and there is a connection. As soon as the woiba falls to the ground, that's the fruit, falls to the ground, this tells us the turtles are ready to mate and the woibad is formed in the mother, ready to fertilise. When the woiba fruit rots, we know the season is over. When we see these signs, we teach our children to prepare themselves for the turtle mating season and make plans to hunt and collect the eggs for special meals. But with climate change, when the trees and the other signs are confused, we don't see the migration of the birds. The flowering of the fruit is out of sequence. We cannot teach and pass on our culture to our children. In 2022, we never really had a season of turtle mating. In around September, normally they'd be mating in the ocean, floating along, hundreds of them. The biribiri migration, the eucalyptus flower and the woiba fruit in cohesion used to be a perfect happening to indicate the turtle mating. It used to be in abundance and now it's not. In early 2022, we had a whole herd of dugong out on the reef close to the island. It was unusual because we don't have seagrass on top of those reefs. It was easy pickings. It was as if they were saying, I have no choice now, I must be here. For them to abandon the areas out on the reefs further out, to come in swimming around on sandbanks where they can be caught and where there's nothing to eat, it's very confusing. It tells me that something is wrong. We live on an island that is changing. It's not our fault that climate is changing. We are the least polluting people in the world. Everybody else is polluting the planet, like mainland Australians, and we're getting the effects. It's really not fair. We're struggling all our lives and now these things on top. What do we do? And if I were you and you were me, knowing what you know now, what would you do? So what's to be done? How do we provoke genuine engagement with thorny issues? An engagement that we so desperately need if we're going to survive the great challenges to humanity now facing us. How do we tap the nascent creativity of human beings, reawaken the ghosts of disappearing childhood dreams, where anything is possible and the world is full of wonder waiting to be discovered? Perhaps the answer partially lies within ourselves. Individually and collectively, we are some of the most powerful and most privileged human beings on the planet, now and at any time in our history. Yet it is a power and a privilege harboured by the few and not by the many, reinforced by our educational methods and the inequity inherent in our macro and microeconomic policies and fiscal policies, by our critical failure to solve problems with the power of a collective mind. So let's take up the challenge for our children of working as we can, while we can, in their interest. To find the words that persuade and cut through the endless chatter and spin that fills our lives with endless obsession with our phones, with words instead that resonate and empower. Let us argue rationally for solutions based on evidence, to challenge accepted wisdom from a position of inquiry rather than rancour, to be nuanced, to argue without bitterness, personal attack or exaggeration. Let us imagine systems that serve us, including our most vulnerable, and work towards transformation of what we have for what is possible. Because if we don't begin to imagine, then we'll see more of the same. As a species, we are adaptive. It's one of our extraordinary talents, but it's a capacity to adapt that depends upon a recognisable threat and a long horizon. We learn and then we teach the next generation that the predator on the savannah or the hot fire is a threat to be avoided and defeated. That living in a particular place and a particular way will keep us safe. These psychological lessons and the consequential neurodevelopmental imprints on our grey matter are linked to pain and context in manageable chunks. Survive the threat, figure it out, recognise what that threat was, and teach it to the ones that follow, so that those children and those that follow know to avoid and deal with the threat. This is an adaptation of our human species that depends upon slow thinking, transgenerational learning, transgenerational, in evolutionary terms, the blink of an eye. We have the capacity for rational, step-by-step reasoning, but we rarely engage this reasoning. As our support for the institutions such as this that support slow learning, our learned academies and universities, and the arts in all their forms are stripped away, we must exert the effort to maintain our ability for deep learning. We are constantly distracted by our immediate needs and the acquisition of comfort. We can't imagine the harm of the invisible and cling doggedly to our notions that individual freedoms that brought us a great sense of control in our lives should never be subverted to the collective good. The fact is that we are pretty bad, actually, at perceiving risks and threats that are invisible. So we need this generational storytelling to alter our heuristics and thus our behaviour. Even when our very survival depends on it, we can't see these things. Because our current response to the global existential threat of climate change at the moment is clearly every man for himself. No amount of tinkering will make any difference until we can develop those skills of deep learning and collaboration. What are we to do when only a few of us are listening to the wisdom of our Barry Jones, our Galilei Yunupingu, our Elizabeth Everts and our Gillian Triggs? First, we have to acknowledge the extraordinary risk that our own biological hardwiring represents in our ability to address crises of national and global magnitude. Second, we have to buttress the institutions and technologies that support our ability to think our way out of this, to think deeply across new areas of study in both science and humanities, even when we want to stop thinking about those things and spend an hour on solitaire on our phones. We need to bolster the arts, knowing as we do that immersion in all forms of art are essential for our deep learning facilities. It's essential that we continue to buttress the tools of democracy, truth and accountability, and integrity in office if we're to stand a chance in the face of overwhelming odds, so that the conventions and customs, including those in the law and systems of justice that have protected us, are instead renewed and strengthened. This is the opportunity at this moment now to learn that every man for himself has actually not served us as human beings. And we need three things at least to make that happen. We need information, we need resources, and we need memory. In terms of information, we know that information is power and a source of domination. So we need public entities to know things and record things in a way that we can access. We need open access to data and the means of understanding what it means. We need to be able to scrutinise things and the public record from all angles. We will need the help of the machines and their incredible powers of fast learning to complement our own. Money is next. We'll need to invest resources in the search for truth in all places, for our archiving and recording, assurance and audit processes. We need an expert, secure and courageous public service committed to serving the public good. And finally, we need to remember. We need the historians and the anthropologists and a multitude of wise elders, like those sitting before us, to teach the intergenerational lessons, and then to repeat them, and then to repeat them again. I want to finish by reading you something from a speech given at a dinner a couple of years ago to celebrate the appointment of the new then Queen's Counsel, senior counsels across Australia. Each year this is held in the High Court, and we celebrate those who have stepped up to these leadership positions with the High Court and other judges around Australia. The guest speaker was the second Indigenous silk appointed in Australia, and his name is Shane Drumgold. You may have heard his name recently in the context of a row made public between police and the ACT Director of Public Prosecutions over allegations levelled at Mr Bruce Lemon. Now just continued. Shane said this: "I grew up in a place labelled Struggled Street, the poverty-stricken public housing estate of Mount Druin in Sydney's outer western suburbs, to a mother who was the victim of chronic domestic violence and a mentally ill father, who just did not fit into society. I knew universities existed, but other than our local GP, none of my family actually knew anyone who'd attended one. Having lost several of my siblings to the metabolites of marginalisation, I dropped out of school at 15 and then left home. A few years later, my father wandered alone into the bushland and took his own life. He felt he wasn't welcome in this world, so he left. I am the answer to the question, what if things had been different for them? So I want to conclude tonight by asking two things of you today, and I particularly address these to the young women sitting in the back of the room. The first thing I want to ask you is, be the answer to that question. What if things had been different for them in your life in any way you can? This is the only way we'll truly bring justice to all our lives. And second, let young people know that we did our best and now they are the future. When you, at the back of this room, truly come to understand that you are the future, you will be unstoppable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I'm Therese Hopfenbeck, and I have the great honor to say a few words and thank you for you today. And one of the first things I would like to say is that your wonderful speech, which was so filled of passion also, said so well the things we need to think about. So I'm almost scared of saying anything, but I will give you a few reflections. I will particularly thank you for the compassion and the integrity you have shared with us today. Because I think this is one of the reasons I'm a very proud new professor of this wonderful place, the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Because this is a place where we come together and we have these really challenging conversations. Because what you were sharing with us tonight, it was not all easy to listen to. And I don't think that was the key either. You have given us food for thoughts. You have made us reflect upon our past, and you have also made us reflect upon what we can do next. And with all these young, wonderful women who are sitting here and almost have this heavy burden on their shoulders, you are our hope for the future. I want you also to know that we will be behind you, cheering for you. Because that is also what we do here at the graduate school. We are educating for the future. And we want to be together with the young ones and talk about the future leaders. And Fiona, thank you for raising what I believe is the key issues for the future. We need to figure out and tackle how we will support each other. I will thank you for raising the collectiveness, the awareness of the short and long thinking, the deep thinking, and actually allowing us to spend time to think and reflect together. I will particularly thank you for telling the stories of the cases, the 3 cases, which has had an impact on your work. Because while you were talking, we could imagine those people. And that is so important, that when we're talking about evidence, when we're reading in the newspapers and listening to the news, there's a story and there's a personal life and people behind those numbers, and you reminded us of that. So thank you for your passion. I think you have inspired all of us, and I wish you all the best in what you will do now, and we're so pleased for having you as one of our thought leaders among us. Thank you.
Thank you. Fiona, I know that you've got a lot of awards. I talked about them at the beginning, and so this one might sit at the back of your counter where you put the awards, but we'd like to present you with something that will remind you of tonight and certainly remind us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent,
It's been
thank
great.
you. Thank you all.